They said I was lucky she even stayed with me as long as she did. They said that at 67, with a bad knee, and a pension that barely covered the electric bill, I should be grateful for whatever scraps they decided to leave behind. My daughter-in-law actually used the word scraps. Standing over my wife's grave, with the Tennessee clay still wet on the shovel, she used that word like it was a kindness. They had no idea that the woman in that casket had spent 28 years building a fortress around me, and they had no idea that she had handed me the key before she closed her eyes for the last time. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it started. My wife Dorothy drove to a storage facility on the edge of town every single Saturday morning for 28 years. She told me she was organizing her sister's old belongings. Furniture that nobody wanted to throw away, but nobody wanted to keep either. I never questioned it. None her friend. Also friend either too. Dorothy was the kind of woman who took care of things quietly. She mended what was broken before you even noticed it was broken. She kept the calendar, balanced the checkbook, smiled at neighbors, and made pot roast on Sundays. I was a firefighter for 31 years. I worked long shifts and came home exhausted and grateful that someone had kept the house from falling apart while I was gone. I trusted her with everything because she had never given me a single reason not to. She was diagnosed 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor used words like aggressive and rapid, and we need to move quickly. And Dorothy sat in that sterile office chair, held my hand, and asked the doctor if she had time to handle some personal business before the treatment started. Not whether she would survive, whether she had time. That should have told me everything. But I was too busy trying not to cry in front of her to notice. She passed on a Thursday morning in April. The dogwood outside our bedroom window was blooming. She loved dogwoods. I held her hand until it went still. And then I sat there for a long time, not knowing what to do with my own hands. The funeral was small. Dorothy had asked for small. Some neighbors came, a few women from her church circle, my old captain from the station, and of course, our son Craig and our daughter Pauline. Craig drove in from Atlanta with his wife Sandra. Pauline came alone. She had recently separated from her husband and was living in a rented room in Knoxville, doing God knows what with her money. I remember standing at the graveside, thinking that my children looked impatient, not devastated, not even sad. Exactly, more like people waiting for a long meeting to finally end. Sandra was the one who approached me first. She always was. Craig had a habit of sending his wife ahead of him like a scout, letting her absorb the difficult conversations, while he stood just close enough to nod along. She was dressed in a black blazer that looked more boardroom than burial, and she came at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she was sorry for my loss. Then she said she needed to talk to me about the house. I looked at her. The house. Dorothy wasn't in the ground 20 minutes and Sandra was talking about the house. She explained it with the patient tone of someone who has rehearsed their lines. She said that Craig had been under significant financial strain lately. His landscaping company had taken on too much debt, expanding into a new market, and the bank was not being cooperative. She said that Pauline also had serious credit problems, which I already knew, and that the family as a whole was in a difficult position. She said that a house like mine, a 4-bedroom on 2 acres outside Nashville, was sitting there underutilized. She said that word, underutilized, like my home was a piece of commercial real estate that wasn't performing. She said it made more sense for me to move into an assisted living community. There was one nearby. She had already taken a tour. It had activities, and a dining hall, and medical staff on site. She said Dorothy would have wanted me to be cared for properly instead of rattling around alone in a big house. I stood there in the April wind and looked at my son. Craig was studying the middle distance with great concentration, as if there was something fascinating happening just beyond the tree line. He couldn't look at me. He never could. When he knew he was doing something wrong. I said I wasn't going anywhere. Sandra said that wasn't exactly my decision to make anymore. She explained that 6 months ago, while I had been at Dorothy's chemotherapy appointments, Dorothy had signed a power of attorney. Sandra said the document gave Craig authority over the estate and that they had already been in contact with a realtor. She said she was telling me now, at the funeral, because she didn't want there to be any confusion later. She called it communication. I drove home alone. I sat in the driveway for 15 minutes before I could make myself go inside. The house felt enormous and hollow, and it smelled like Dorothy's hand lotion, that lavender and almond smell that I had stopped noticing for years and now would have given anything to breathe in forever. I walked through the rooms. I needed to move. I couldn't sit still. I found myself in Dorothy's little home office at the end of the hallway. The room she called her thinking room. It had a desk, a filing cabinet, her sewing basket in the corner, and a small corkboard above the desk where she pinned things she wanted to remember. Church schedules, a recipe torn from a magazine, a photo of us from the year we drove up to Gatlinburg for our anniversary. I pulled open the top drawer of the filing cabinet. I was looking for anything, some document that would tell me whether Sandra was telling the truth about the power of attorney. I dug through files the way a drowning man digs through water, desperately and without a clear plan. I found the utility bills. I found the insurance folders. I found a whole section of medical paperwork from the past year, every scan and every lab report filed in chronological order in a cream-colored folder with my name written on the tab. Not Dorothy's name. My name. She had been organizing her illness so that I could find the papers when I needed them. I sat down on the floor and pressed my back against the filing cabinet and breathed. When I could stand again, I started looking differently. I wasn't searching for a weapon anymore. I was paying attention. I was reading her room the way I used to read a burning building, looking for where the heat was hiding. On the corkboard above the desk, tucked behind the Gatlinburg photo, was a small index card. Written on it in Dorothy's handwriting were 4 words and a number. Sunrise Storage, Unit 114. I stared at it. Sunrise Storage. That was where she went every Saturday. That was the sisters' furniture that nobody wanted. I had never once asked to see it. I had never offered to go with her. I had believed her completely and entirely, and for 28 years, I had not asked a single follow-up question. I found the keyring in the bottom of her desk drawer. It held 2 keys. One was a standard padlock key with a red rubber grip. The other was smaller, older, with a stamped number on the head. I didn't recognize the second one. The number was 88. There was a logo on the key that was worn smooth, but I could still make out the shape of it. An oak tree. The logo of First Tennessee Trust. I held both keys in my palm and stood in her office in the dark and tried to understand what I was looking at. Whatever it was, she had hidden it behind a photograph of the 2 of us at Gatlinburg, which meant she had hidden it somewhere she knew I would eventually look. Not because she expected me to go snooping, because she knew that when she was gone, I would stand in her room and look at the things that mattered most to her. And that photo mattered. She left it where I would find it when I needed it. That was Dorothy. All the way down to the bone. The next morning was Saturday. I put on decent clothes, and I drove to Sunrise Storage on Murfreesboro Pike. It was a plain facility. Chain-link fencing and yellow-painted doors. The kind of place you pass 100 times and never really see. I gave my name at the front desk. The woman behind the counter checked something on her computer and looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. She said, "Mr. Mercer, we were wondering when you'd come." She said Dorothy had updated the access authorization 2 months before she passed. She said my name was on the account. She walked me back herself. Unit 114 was not the size of a storage unit that holds a dead sister's furniture. It was a full room, climate-controlled, lit by a fluorescent overhead. And it was meticulous. Dorothy organized everything in her life with care, but this was a different level of care. This was the kind of order that takes years to build and maintain. There were no old couches. There were no boxes of photograph albums or old kitchen appliances. There were filing cabinets along one wall. 6 of them, all locked. There was a folding table in the center with 2 chairs, like she had expected to sit here and work. On the table was a single manila envelope with my name on it in her handwriting. I sat down in one of those chairs and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter. It was 3 pages long, and it was dated 4 months before she died. She wrote the way she talked, directly and without decoration. She said she was sorry for the secret. She said she knew I would be angry. And then she said she also knew I would understand once I read everything. She said she started in 1997 when her father left her a small inheritance, $11,000, and she hadn't told me because she'd known I would want to use it for Craig's college fund, and she'd already decided that Craig needed to learn to earn things, or he never would. She said she'd invested the $11,000 in a rental house in East Nashville when that neighborhood was still unfashionable and the numbers made sense. She said it grew from there. She wrote about buying a second house in 2001 when the market dipped after the towers fell. She wrote about a third property in 2004 and a fourth in 2008, and how that year had terrified her because everything was collapsing. But she had held on because she was Dorothy, and Dorothy did not panic. She wrote about the stock account she opened at First Tennessee Trust in 2003 and how she had fed it small amounts every month, buying slowly and never selling when the news was bad. She wrote that the properties were professionally managed through a small company called DRM Property Solutions. She said, I would find the contact information in the top drawer of the second filing cabinet. She said the company handled everything: the tenants, the maintenance, the accounting, and the taxes, and that DRM stood for Dorothy Ruth Mercer. She had named her company after herself, and I had never known it existed. At the bottom of the third page, she wrote, Robert, I know you wonder why I never told you. You are the most honest man I have ever known. You would have insisted on declaring all of it, on being transparent with the children, on treating it like a family asset instead of a shield. And it needed to be a shield. Not from the world, from our own children. I watched Craig and Sandra for 15 years, and I watched Pauline for just as long, and I saw what they would do when they smelled money. I needed you protected. I needed this untouchable. I am sorry for carrying it alone, but I am not sorry for doing it. I love you. Now open the second filing cabinet. I sat in that storage unit for a long time before I could stand. I am not ashamed to say that. A man can cry in a storage unit. No one was there to see it except Dorothy, and she already knew I would. When I opened the second cabinet, I found the DRM files. I found the property management agreements, the lease records, the maintenance logs. I found 8 properties total, all in Nashville, all paid off. The most recent appraisals were clipped to the front of each file. I added the numbers on the back of the envelope without a calculator. Then I found the First Tennessee Trust folder. I found the small old key in the envelope inside it. Box 88. The key from the key ring. I drove to First Tennessee Trust on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I was wearing my good flannel shirt and my best boots, which is different from dressed up, but it was what I had. I walked in and told the woman at the desk that I needed to access a safe deposit box. She asked my name and typed it into the system, and then she excused herself without explaining why. I watched her walk quickly toward the back offices. This was familiar territory. I had spent 31 years reading situations. She was going for someone senior. Something about my name had triggered a response. The man who came out was perhaps 60 himself, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that had been expensive 20 years ago and was comfortable now. He introduced himself as Thomas Everett, the branch manager. He shook my hand with both of his, the way people do when they mean it. He said he was very sorry about Dorothy. He said she had been one of the most remarkable clients he'd known in 30 years of banking. He said she had told him I would come, and that I would probably look like I hadn't slept in a week, and that I should be taken straight back without any fuss. He took me straight back without any fuss. Box 88 was smaller than I expected. When Thomas set it on the table in the private viewing room, it looked too plain to contain anything important. I opened it. There was no cash. There were 2 things inside: a folded document and a second letter, shorter than the one in the storage unit, more hurried. Like she'd written it, when time was already short. The document was a trust agreement. Dorothy had established the Dorothy R. Mercer Living Trust 18 months ago. before the diagnosis was confirmed, but after she'd had the first scan that told her something was wrong. The document named me as the sole trustee and primary beneficiary. It listed the 8 properties and the investment account and a cash reserve. Thomas, sitting across the table from me, quietly slid a valuation summary across the surface. The total was $4,340,000. I pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling. I had worried about money every year of my working life. I had skipped vacations. I had driven trucks with 200,000 miles on them. I had eaten peanut butter sandwiches for lunch for 15 years so we could pay the mortgage early. And sitting here on a table the size of a card game was $4.33 million in 8 houses in Nashville, one of the fastest appreciating real estate markets in the country. Thomas said something I will never forget. He said Dorothy told him once that she wasn't building wealth. She was building a guarantee that Robert Mercer would never have to ask his children for anything. I read the second letter when Thomas stepped out to give me privacy. She had written, "I know Sandra talked to you at the funeral. I know because Sandra is predictable, and I watched her practice this performance for years. Check the red notebook in the top left drawer of the second filing cabinet. It isn't pleasant reading, but you need to see it before you decide what to do next. Remember what I always told you. Know what you're holding before you decide whether to fold." The red notebook. I drove back to the storage unit that afternoon. I found the notebook exactly where she said. It was spiral bound, and the cover was red, the kind you buy at any drugstore. Dorothy had used her clean, compact handwriting to fill it, 1 entry per page, each one dated and labeled with a name. Craig, Pauline, Sandra. The entries went back 12 years. I read them in the order she'd written them. Craig had borrowed $40,000 in 2012 to cover a business loan default that he told us was a billing dispute. In 2015, he'd needed $22,000 for legal costs related to a contract dispute with a former employee, a dispute that the red notebook described in terms that made it clear Craig had been the wrongdoer. In 2019, there was a $30,000 entry labeled DUI settlement, third party, non-disclosure agreement required. My son had been in 3 serious financial crises in 12 years, and each time Dorothy had quietly paid the debt and let Craig believe he had handled it himself. Craig didn't know where the money came from. He just knew that when he called his mother in a low voice so I wouldn't hear, things got resolved. Pauline's entries were shorter, but they weren't smaller. Gambling losses in 2016, $14,000. A payday loan spiral in 2018 that Dorothy had untangled for nearly $9,000. A landlord dispute in 2020 where Pauline had destroyed an apartment and Dorothy had covered the damages to keep it from going to collections. Sandra's entry was different. Sandra had come to Dorothy alone in 2017. She had embezzled from the company where she worked before Craig's landscaping business, a small marketing firm in Atlanta. She had taken just under $30,000 over 2 years, replacing it with small amounts until she couldn't keep up. Dorothy had paid the restitution through an attorney with a non-disclosure agreement. Sandra still worked in marketing. Her reputation was intact. Her husband did not know. At the bottom of the last page in the notebook, Dorothy had written a single line. "The trust documents classify them as recoverable debts due upon my death. Robert decides what to do with this information, not them." I closed the notebook and sat in the folding chair in Unit 114 for a while. 2 days after I read the notebook, my son and his wife arrived at the house with boxes. They were not boxes for my things. They were boxes for their things, as though they were already moving in. Sandra directed Craig to stack them in the living room. She walked through the house room by room, making assessments, opening closets, running her hand along the countertops, talking about what they would update after the sale. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when she walked in. She seemed surprised to find me there, as if she had expected me to have already begun the process of disappearing. She sat down across from me and placed a folder on the table. Inside were printouts, a listing comparison showing what similar homes in the area had sold for, a brochure for a senior living community called Meadow Ridge, which had a pool and a shuttle bus and a dining room with assigned seating. She said she knew this was hard. She said it in the tone of someone who did not believe it was hard at all, but had been advised by someone to say so. I looked at the brochure. I looked at the folder. I looked at Sandra. I asked her how her old job at the marketing firm was going. The silence was immediate and total. Sandra went very still. She looked at me the way people look at something they've decided isn't dangerous right before they discover it is. She said she'd left that company years ago. I said I knew. I said I also knew why. Her face cycled through 3 different expressions. Confusion, then calculation, then a kind of pale, controlled fear. I said I needed a few more days before I could discuss any of this, and I asked her to take the boxes back out to the car. She left without arguing. I watched from the kitchen window as she and Craig loaded the boxes back into the trunk. They stood beside the car, talking in low, fast voices. Craig kept running his hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a teenager. Sandra was pointing at the house. Neither of them looked like people who had won anything. That evening I called an attorney named Patricia Hollis, who had been recommended to me by Thomas Everett at the bank. He'd said she was aggressive and meticulous, and had no tolerance for people who tried to push elderly clients around. He said she would enjoy this particular case. She answered on the second ring and told me she had been expecting my call. 2 weeks after the funeral, I asked Craig and Sandra and Pauline to meet me at Patricia's office downtown. I told them we needed to discuss the estate. I wore the new blazer I had purchased the day before at a department store, with a debit card linked to the DRM operating account. The young woman at the store had asked if I was dressing for something special. I said I was. She asked what the occasion was. I thought about it and said it was a graduation of sorts. They arrived together, all 3 of them, which I had expected. There is safety in numbers when you expect to be confronted. They sat across the long conference table from me and Patricia, and they arranged themselves the way they always did. Sandra slightly forward, Craig beside her and slightly back, Pauline at the end. Sandra opened by saying she hoped we could handle this like adults. Patricia said she was certain we could. She introduced herself, and then she described the trust. She explained the structure calmly and completely. She explained what a living trust was and how it differed from a will and how it functioned in the state of Tennessee. She explained that the power of attorney Sandra had mentioned did not supersede the trust and had in fact been a draft document prepared by an online service that Dorothy had never signed. Sandra said that couldn't be right. Patricia said she was happy to show her the documentation if she needed to verify it. There was a pause. Sandra looked at Craig. Craig looked at the table. Patricia then described the assets. She used a clear and neutral tone, the way a doctor delivers a serious diagnosis. 8 properties, 1 investment account, 1 cash reserve. Total valuation as of the current week, $4,410,000, the number slightly higher than Thomas's earlier estimate because the market had moved. Pauline made a sound like she had been struck lightly in the chest. Sandra reached for Craig's arm. She gripped it. I could see her fingers whiten. Craig said he needed a moment. His voice was barely functional. Patricia gave them a moment. She poured water from the pitcher on the table and set glasses in front of each of them. Then, she pulled out 3 separate envelopes and placed one in front of each of them. She said that as trustee, I had asked her to call in the outstanding debts to the estate. She explained what was in each envelope. She explained that under Tennessee law and the terms of the trust, the amounts were recoverable. Craig's envelope totaled $92,000. Pauline's totaled $23,000. Sandra's was $30,000, the exact amount Dorothy had paid for the restitution, plus interest. Sandra stood up. I had been waiting for that. She said this was extortion. She said it was retaliation. She said I didn't understand what I was doing and that a man my age who had spent his career in manual labor was not equipped to manage a trust of this complexity, and that she was going to contest the competency evaluation, and she was, I'm going to find that unsigned power of attorney, and she was, going to speak to a real attorney. An actual attorney. Not someone hired by a grieving old man who was being manipulated by a bank that wanted access to his assets. She was good at this. I will give her that. Under different circumstances, I might have been impressed. I let her finish. I waited for the echo of it to settle out of the room. Then I reached into my jacket and placed the red notebook in the center of the table. I said Dorothy kept records. Sandra stared at the notebook. Her face went through the same sequence it had in my kitchen, but faster and more compressed, like a film on double speed. I said the marketing firm's current general counsel had been very interested when Patricia's office reached out. I said that non-disclosure agreements expire and that the passage of time and the involvement of a third party in a trust dispute changed the calculus considerably. I said I had no interest in going to the authorities, that I had never had any interest in that, and that I understood that people make mistakes when they're desperate. I said, but Sandra had been willing to have me removed from my home and placed in an institution so that she and my son could liquidate assets that didn't belong to them. I said, that was not a mistake. That was a choice. And choices have consequences. Sandra sat back down, very slowly, like her legs had decided to leave the conversation. Craig said Dad in a voice that was not the voice of a grown man who runs a landscaping company in Atlanta. It was the voice of the boy who used to knock on my bedroom door at 2 a.m. when he'd had a nightmare and didn't want to wake his mother. I looked at my son for a long time. I said I loved him. I said that was not in question, and it never would be. I said that what was in question was whether I could trust him. I said his mother had spent decades asking that same question and had concluded that the answer was not yet, but maybe someday. And so she had protected him from himself, rather than cutting him loose. And in doing so, she had also protected me from having to make that choice while she was alive. Now she was not alive, and the choice was mine. I said the debts were being called in. I said I would give them 6 months to arrange payment. I said I was not going to allow liens on their wages or accounts if they cooperated. But if they did not cooperate, Patricia had full authority to pursue every legal avenue available. I stood up. I said the house was not for sale. I said I would be staying in it for as long as I chose. I said Meadow Ridge looked like a perfectly fine place, and I hoped they would enjoy the brochure. I picked up the notebook. I walked out. The drive home took 40 minutes because of traffic on the interstate, and I spent most of it not thinking about anything at all. Dorothy had a term for this. She called it clearing the slate. She said sometimes after a hard thing, you just have to let your mind go quiet before you decide what to think. I cleared the slate all the way to the Shelby Avenue exit. The months that followed were not simple. Craig called several times in the first few weeks. Some of the calls were angry. Some of them were frightened. 2 of them were something that sounded like genuine. I kept them all brief, and I told him the same thing every time. That when he was ready to talk about what had actually happened between us, not about money and not about the house, but about what had happened, I would be there. Sandra stopped calling after the 2nd week. I heard through Pauline that she and Craig were in counseling. I did not ask for details. Pauline was a different conversation. Pauline had always been more like me than she knew, uncomfortable with confrontation, and too proud to ask for help until the situation was already critical. She came to the house alone about a month after the meeting, without calling ahead, and stood on the porch looking like she was expecting me to send her away. I opened the door and made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She talked about the gambling the way people talk about something they're ashamed of but done hiding. She said she'd been in a program for 14 months. She said she'd been afraid to tell Dorothy because she didn't want to be a burden, and the irony of that, she said, was not lost on her, given what we now knew Dorothy had already paid to cover her debts. I pushed the notebook across the table and let her read her own entries. She read them twice. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She said she was sorry. I said I knew. I said her mother knew too. I used part of the trust to pay off Pauline's remaining debts directly, not as a gift, but structured as the loan it had always been. Now, with a repayment schedule she could actually meet. Patricia thought I was being too generous. I said Patricia wasn't Pauline's father. The 8 properties are still generating income. Patricia and Thomas helped me establish a management review process, so I understand what's happening with each one, rather than delegating blindly. I am not naturally a financial person, but I am not stupid and I am capable of learning things at 67 just as well as I could at 37. Dorothy knew that. She left the system simple enough for me to understand and complex enough to protect me. I have kept the Monday rhythm. Not Saturdays, the way Dorothy did, but Mondays. Every Monday morning I drive to the storage unit and sit at that folding table and go through the monthly reports that DRM's property manager sends over. It is unglamorous work, reading spreadsheets in a fluorescent-lit room with a folding chair that was not designed with an old firefighter's knees in mind. But it is my work now. It is the work Dorothy left me. I have also started a small fund through First Tennessee Trust for emergency housing assistance, working with a local nonprofit that helps elderly residents facing eviction due to family fraud or financial exploitation. Thomas helped me structure it. Patricia helped me name it. We called it the Dorothy R. Mercer Fund because Dorothy would have said that was too much. Which means it was exactly enough. Last month I got a call from Craig. Not one of the frightened calls or the angry ones. He asked if he could come to Nashville for a weekend. He said he wanted to sit in his mother's thinking room if that was all right. He said he had some things he wanted to say to me that weren't easy to say over the phone. I told him to come. He sat in that small office at the end of the hallway, in the chair Dorothy had used, and he looked at the corkboard with the Gatlinburg photo still pinned to it. He didn't say much for a while. He just looked at everything the way you look at a place that used to mean something to you and still does, even after you've behaved in ways that should have forfeited the right. Eventually, he said he didn't know about any of it, about the money, about what Sandra had planned, about the extent of it. He said by the time he understood what was happening, he had already gone too far to find his way back, without losing Sandra's respect. And, at the time, he had confused Sandra's approval with his own worth as a person. He said he was working on that. I said, I could see that. We had dinner together. I made pot roast because it was a Sunday, and because Dorothy made it every Sunday, and because some things you keep doing, not out of habit, but out of love for the person who taught you to do them. After he left, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The way Dorothy used to stand there in the evenings watching the yard go dark. The dogwood was past blooming, but the leaves were full, and the yard looked like it always had. Like a place where someone was tending things carefully, even when no one was watching. Dorothy drove to a storage unit every Saturday for 28 years and built a life in secret that protected me from things I didn't even know were coming. She carried that alone through chemotherapy and through the last year of her life, and she never once asked for credit or reassurance or thanks. She just built the wall and made sure I would find the door. I don't know how to repay that. I am not sure it is repayable. What I can do is take care of what she left. Not just the properties and the accounts and the fund with her name on it. I mean what she actually left, which was a model for how a person with limited resources and unlimited patience and absolute clarity about what matters can quietly build something that outlasts them. She left me proof that love is not only a feeling. Sometimes love is an 8-property portfolio in Nashville, and a red notebook, and a key to a box marked 88, and a note that says, I know you. I trust you. Now, handle it. I am handling it. And for anyone out there who has been told they are too old, too simple, too dependent to manage what is theirs, I am here to tell you that the people who say that are usually the same people who stand to benefit from you believing it. Don't believe it. Look at what you're holding before you decide whether to fold. My wife taught me that. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and come back next week. There are more stories where this one came from, and every one of them is about someone who was counted out and came back. Leave me a comment and tell me whether you think I handled Craig the right way. I will read every one of them.